Hi guys, this is Lauren with Lauren Watkins Art, and today we are going to be painting a donut using watercolor. Now here is a drawing guide that you can use to help you if you would like to follow along with this project. We are going to be using quinacridone red, Gamboge, Ultramarine Blue, Violet, and Burnt Sienna for this painting. Once I had my image all sketched out, I added water to the Burnt Sienna and Gamboge and then mixed them together on my palette. This is to create a nice warm brown color. And then I took a round paintbrush and I carefully added that color to the areas of the donut that are not covered in frosting. Now this is just the first layer of paint, and I'll be making more layers of paint on top. So I'm not going for a super dark brown just yet. This is just a lighter mid-tone brown. And remember, if your color is too dark with watercolors, you just add a little bit more water to it and that will lighten it up. So I ended up not liking where one of the sprinkles was placed. I didn't like how it wasn't on the frosting, so I decided to erase that before I painted that section, because once I got water and paint over that area, I wouldn't be able to erase it. And with watercolor being transparent, it would still show up. So if you see something you don't like, make sure you erase it before you start painting over it. The type of wash I'm doing for this is called wet on dry, and this is where you apply wet paint onto dry paper. This will give you the most control using watercolors because your paint will flow wherever the paper's wet. So applying wet paint onto dry paper, the paint will go precisely where you apply it. It's not going to flow out of control. It will be a lot more precise and you'll have a lot more control over it. Once the brown paint was 100% dry, it was time to work on the pink frosting. So I started by activating my quinacridone red. This is a very pink or cool based red. I actually put that paint on two areas of my palette because one section I wanted to stay the pure red, and then the other I wanted to add a little bit of ultramarine blue to make a little bit more of a red-violet color. Once my colors were prepped, I went in and wet the entire area of the donut that was going to be frosting. I'm just using a large round paintbrush for this so I can wet the paper quickly. I even painted over the sprinkles with the water because painting around them was going to be too much of a hassle. By pre-wetting the paper, it will allow my paint to flow and blend and create really soft edges when I apply it to the paper. This is called a wet into wet wash. This is also why it's really important to wait for that brown section to dry completely, because if it was still damp, when I apply a wet into wet wash like this right next to that, that paint will flow into those brown areas, and you don't want that to happen. Once the frosting area was completely wet, I went in with my red-violet paint and I started applying that to the areas of frosting where the shadows were going to be the darkest. So on the inner ring of the donut and then on the outer edges of it. Once I got those shadow areas all blocked in and I was happy with where they were sitting, I diluted the red-violet paint with a little bit of water, and then I filled in the rest of the frosting area with that diluted paint. Remember when you're working with watercolor that you are working light to dark. So anything you want to keep a bright highlight, you don't want to add paint to, and you can always darken things up after the fact. Then I took some violet and I added it to our red-violet mixture so that I could have a more purpley violet color, and I am applying that to those shadow areas. I am also working very quickly because I don't want my paper to dry out before I can apply this color, or else I'll stop getting the nice soft blends. Because as your paper dries, there's less paint or water to help your paint flow. For the light source on this piece, I'm having it kind of come from the slightly upper right side. So the shadows are going to be on the slightly lower left side of the donut on the outer ring, and then on the inner ring, they're going to be on the upper right of the inner circle. I did add more blue to our mix, so now it's more of a blue-violet color, and this is to create the darkest areas of the shadows. And I am applying this with the point of my paintbrush because I don't want to cover everything I've done so far. And so if you're having a hard time controlling where your paint's going, sometimes sizing down on your paintbrush will help you have a little bit more control as you are developing that skill of brush control. Then I decided I wanted to warm it up just a smidge, so I added a little bit of red to the mix, and I am applying that, and you can see that it is not flowing very much, and that's because my paper is starting to dry. So the areas where the paint isn't flowing or creating soft edges, what I did was I dipped my paintbrush into the water. I made sure it wasn't like soaking wet, it was just damp, and then I am gently rubbing my brush over those edges, and that helps pull the paint and soften it up, and because the paint will flow wherever I've added that water. Now, be careful not to add too much water or to brush too vigorously, or it will lift the paint that you've already applied off of the paper, and then you'll have this big empty spot with no pigment at all. And I am going back in and I'm refining the shadows, and I realized I needed to let my donut dry. So that's why we have this jump, and I paused, let the paper dry completely, and then I went back in with some more layers, because if I had kept layering it while it was wet, I would have just lifted up everything I had done, and I would have gotten frustrated. So if your paint isn't kind of working the way you want it to work, pause, let it dry completely so it's no longer cool to the touch, and then come back to it. Now I'm taking my blue mixture and I am darkening up those shadows. Now, two things to keep in mind with watercolor. One, your paints dry lighter than what they appear like when they're wet. Acrylics dry darker, watercolors dry lighter. So it will lighten up as it dries. Two, as you add other colors around it, something may have seemed dark enough at the beginning, but then as you've added other colors next to it, it's no longer dark enough. Okay, especially with watercolor and you're working on a bright white paper, anything will seem dark on a bright white paper, but then as you add other values next to it, then you need to darken it up so you can get a more full value scale. Now, just because you have let it dry completely doesn't mean you can't reactivate paints underneath that you've already applied. So make sure you don't add too much water. You don't want tons of water pooling on it, else it will lift up the paint you've already applied. And be gentle with how hard you're pushing with your paintbrush. If you scrub really hard, it will lift up that paint, and you don't want that to happen unless you are trying to do it intentionally. So if you get paint in an area you don't want, then you can lift it up. So if you have darkened an area too much, you've applied a paint in an area you don't want it to be, you can take a clean, dry rag and just blot it up while it's still wet. If it's dried, you can get your paintbrush wet and kind of scrub over it, like I'm doing right here, and that will lift it up. Now, some paints are staining, and so some colors will lift up better than others. If it's a staining color, quinacridone red is a fairly staining color, it's not going to lift up a ton. A lot of people get frustrated with watercolor because it responds so differently than the other paints they're used to. But the more you practice with it, the more you understand how it's going to respond in different situations. And so you may not have 100% control over how your watercolor will respond, but you'll have a lot more control, and you can intentionally get specific effects when you're using your paints. Then I let that frosting area dry completely, and then it was time to go in and paint the brown areas and add some shadows. So I reactivated the Burnt Sienna, and then I added some Ultramarine Blue to it. Together they make really lovely darks and gray tones. So by adding a little bit of Ultramarine Blue to the brown, it will give us some dark browns that are really harmonious with the rest of the painting, because I've used Ultramarine Blue in other areas, and the base color of the bread part of the donut is Burnt Sienna. I did several mixes of the Ultramarine Blue and Burnt Sienna, changing the ratios where I have some mixes with more Ultramarine Blue and some of them with more Burnt Sienna. That way I have a little bit of a gradient to choose from as I'm adding the shadows. And then I'm going in and adding these colors, paying attention to where I've added shadows on the frosting so that I know where the deepest shadows on the bread part need to be. And then I had some areas where I needed to darken up the bread, but I didn't want it to read too gray. Where the ultramarine blue can gray out and it's a great shadow color, I don't want the whole red areas to read as gray because that's not very appetizing. So what I did was I mixed a little bit of our violet with the burnt sienna. That little bit of blue cools it down, it makes it fall back visually, and it looks like it's in shadow, but it's not reading as too gray. And again, we added that violet to the frosting, so it's pulling that paint color into other areas of this painting, helping it feel more harmonious. Then it was time to move on to the sprinkles. To start off, I decided I wanted to lift up some of the color that I had applied onto the sprinkles when I was painting the frosting in general. So I took a clean paintbrush, dipped it in clean water, and then scrubbed over those sprinkles, and then used a clean towel to dab it off. Quinacridone red is a staining color, so I can't lift the color off completely, but I can lighten it by scrubbing. Now, you can use any cool red for this painting. You don't have to use quinacridone red, so you might be using a red color that lifts up easier. I also decided that I wanted to bring back a few of the highlights on the frosting, so I did that by using the same technique. And this just can help you fix mistakes, or if you've gotten something too dark or you need to bring back a highlight, scrubbing can help you with that. Once I was satisfied with how the frosting was looking, I decided to let that area dry, and while it was drying, I was going to work on the cast shadows. So to create the cast shadows, I am mixing ultramarine blue and burnt sienna to create a gray tone. I am adding more blue to this mix to achieve that gray color. Now I'm going to do the same thing that we did with the frosting. I'm going to pre-wet the paper in the areas where I want the shadow to be, and then I'm going in with the paint. Again, this is called a wet into wet wash, and it's going to create really soft edges. And actually, I wish I had gone in and made I pre-wet the paper just a little bit deeper and a little bit further out than what I had originally, because I had to go back in and kind of soften up and pull that paint a little bit further along. So I did it on the inner ring, and now I'm doing it on the outer edge of the donut as well. And again, just making sure my cast shadow is going to follow the same area and be in the same areas as the shadows on the donut itself. By making sure my shadows are lining up, it's going to help make this be more believable. And the fun thing about adding cast shadows to an object when you're painting like a singular object like this is it really adds weight and makes it feel like your donut or whatever object you're painting is no longer floating in space, and all of a sudden it feels more dimensional and it's kind of popping off the page. Then it was time to start painting the sprinkles, which I really enjoyed painting because it made the painting start coming together. I started off with violet, and then I used ultramarine blue, and then our quinacridone red. Now, I tried to paint these to look more sporadic, like they were just sprinkled onto the donut. And that is a little trickier than what you think, because our brain sometimes wants to create too much order and not enough randomness. So how I got around that was I painted a few of the sprinkles violet, and I tried to make sure I wasn't painting all the same size that color, and I tried to have them spread out throughout the donut. And after I got a few painted, then I switched to the blue, and I painted a few sprinkles blue, again making sure that they were all over the donut. And after I painted a few of those, then I went in with the red, and I painted a few of the sprinkles red, and I just went back and forth. I was worried that if I painted all of the purples at once, I would go in to paint the reds and there wouldn't be enough sprinkles left over, or I would have put too many violets on one side and it would have been a little bit more lopsided. So to get an even distribution, I painted a few one color, went in with another color, and just kind of did this back and forth to fill them all in. Now, to make it look like our sprinkles are cylinder in shape and not just flat, and to make it look like they are sitting on the donut itself and not just floating in front of it, we have to create shadows. So we have to create a shadow itself on the sprinkle, and then we need to create a cast shadow on the donut. And so that cast shadow is the shadow that the sprinkle is casting onto the donut. So to achieve that, what I do is I fill in all of the sprinkles and then I create a more concentrated mix of the color. So for the violet sprinkle, I'm taking the violet paint and I'm adding less water than what I had before, and I am just adding that to the side of the sprinkle that would have a shadow. And you can use where the shadows are on the other donuts as a reference to help guide you. You don't have to be 100% perfect on this, but by adding a little bit of shadows onto the sprinkle itself will go a long way in helping it read as dimensional. Then for the cast shadow, I'm going to take our pink violet mix that we used on the frosting and I diluted it down, and I'm just applying that to the frosting next to where the sprinkle sits on the side that would have a shadow. And that's going to help those sprinkles look like they're sitting on the donut itself and look a little bit more dimensional. So I did a layer of that. I'm going to let it dry and then I'm going to go back in and fine tune it. And while I'm letting it dry, I'm going in and adding more shadows to our donut dough, the area of the donut without any frosting. And I'm just using the Burnt Sienna and Ultramarine mix for this, using a little bit more Ultramarine Blue to darken it up in those areas where the shadows are the darkest. Then I took violet, and on the narrow sections right along the edges where the frosting is butted up next to the bread, I'm using the violet to create those dark shadows, and that will make the frosting look a little bit more dimensional, like it has a little bit more of a curve instead of it being flat onto the frosting. So I'm just going to go in and refine these shadows just a little bit using that Ultramarine Blue, Burnt Sienna mix, and then the violet to just really create these darker shadows so that our frosting is more dimensional. And then once I was happy with that, I went in and added some more shadows on our sprinkles. Now we're reaching the stage of the painting where I'm going to be jumping around a lot. So right now I am adding the shadows to the pink sprinkles because I hadn't, or the red sprinkles because I hadn't added the shadows to those yet. And then I jump around to another area, and then I jump to another area. There's no real rhyme or reason to it. It's just the way my brain functions at this point. I just get distracted and I paint new things. But I wanted to point out there is a little splatter of paint or water pooling on my paper. When you are painting with watercolor, you want to make sure you are not getting unintentional pools of water like that on your painting. On a white background, you might end up with a little ring of color, but if you've painted a whole background and you get a pool of water like that, or a splatter of water, and it's sitting on your picture, as it sits, it's reactivating the paint you've already applied. And when you go to absorb it up, it will lift up the paint you've already painted, or if you leave it to dry, it will create like a white circle with like a bloom on it. Either one of those you don't want, so the sooner you fix it, the less damage it will do to your painting. So now I'm working on the transition of the shadow to the highlight. So we have this bright highlight on the top of the donut, and then we have these darker shadows on the edges. But we need to work on that transition from the shadow to the highlight. And so I'm just taking my red, and it's diluted down, and I am just gently adding that right along the edges of where the shadows are so that it can transition more smoothly into the highlighted areas. I'm just using a small paintbrush for this so that I have a little bit more control, especially since I'm going to be painting around all those little sprinkles. And this is something that you could double check and make sure that you like those transitions before you paint your sprinkles so that you don't have to paint around them. It will make it easier. But sometimes things don't become as apparent of a fix until you add other colors or you paint other areas next to it. So by adding these dark sprinkles to the frosting, it made some of those things become more apparent to me, or I paid attention to them more. And so that's where when I noticed I needed to soften up those transition areas, add a little bit more pink to the frosting, and then I needed to darken up those shadows because those sprinkles were so much darker than the frosting, and it just made it become more apparent to me visually. Now I decided I wanted to deepen up the cast shadows by making them a little bit darker, especially right where it touches the donut, and then extending it out a little bit so that it's a little bit bigger of a cast shadow. I technically didn't need to do this. It looked fine, but when I took a step back, that shadow got lost, and so from a distance, it didn't look as dimensional. It didn't look like the donut was sitting on the paper, which is what I wanted it to look like. So I went back and I deepened up the shadows. Sometimes things will look dimensional and realistic when you're sitting up close to your painting, but you take a few steps back and then it starts to read as flat because your shadows or the contrast or the highlights, whatever it is, it wasn't strong enough. And so often taking a step back and looking at your picture, sometimes flipping it upside down, all those types of things can really help you in knowing what your image might need. Also, taking a picture of it on your phone and then desaturating it can also help you if you're feeling a little stuck, especially if you're getting used to working with color, because sometimes color can distract you from values. And so if you're trying to figure out what your values need to be or how you need to tweak and adjust them, by taking a photo and desaturating it can really help you identify your values separate from color. And we are really reaching that stage where we are just fine-tuning, or I'm just fine-tuning the painting. I'm adding a little bit more shadows to the sprinkles, adding deeper shadows to the edges of the frosting. It's a lot of back and forth. And this is the stage that really can set your painting apart. Oftentimes I see people take a painting to like the 70-75% mark and they call it done. But then they want to know why their picture doesn't look as good as someone else's, or it's not as realistic. I see this with my students all the time. And it's because they think it's done enough. And so I often encourage them to go back, look at their reference photo, and look at those minute details. What little shadows can be tweaked, what little highlights can be adjusted, what colors can be strengthened, whatever it is, looking at their reference photo and comparing it really closely to their painting. And when you are just learning how to paint, this is a really good tool in helping you develop your skills of perception and your skills of like physically painting. And then as you paint your own thing, you can veer away from your reference photo and do your own thing. But it's a great way to develop your skills. Now you are seeing me use a white gel pen. I'm using this to bring back a little bit of a sparkle or a highlight. It's such a small thing, you aren't going to be able to use this to bring back big areas of a highlight. And the gel pen isn't archival and you can't really paint over the top of it. It will reactivate. And some people will say this will make it so it's not a true watercolor painting. You can also use things like a Bombay ink or a gouache to paint over if you need to bring back a highlight, or if you want to preserve the white of your paper beforehand, you can use like a clear wax crayon. They sell them for watercolor, or you can use like a masking fluid and then remove the masking fluid and you have your bright highlight. For me, I was doing this painting in preparation for a class I was about to teach, and I needed to use the supplies that my students had available to them, and they had a white gel pen available to them, so that's what I used. You feel free to use whatever you want and try and experiment with different mediums because you might find one that you like more than I do. Then I signed my painting and I removed my masking tape because I felt like I was done. If you liked this video, please hit the like button. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below and I will do my best to answer them for you. And if you want to see more of what I create, I post videos on Saturdays at least twice a month, and I would love to have you follow along. I hope you have a great day and I'll see you next time. Bye.